Greetings, I'm Herc Castro, coming to you from our state-of-the-art Suspension Development Center in Colorado Springs. Today we're going to learn how to bleed AVID hydraulic disc brakes. There are 5 steps to the process. First, prepare the syringes. Second, prepare the caliper and lever. Third, bleed the caliper. Fourth, bleed the hose. Fifth, bleed the lever, including master cylinder and reservoir. Unless you've done this many times before, we sure do recommend that you read through this AVID hydraulic brake guide, which is on the SRAM website as a PDF. Please print these out and read through them before you put your frame in the stand. Okay, enough preliminaries, let's get down to business. Since we're working with dot brake fluid, we're going to wear nitrile gloves and eye protection. Remember, when bleeding the brakes, you're simply chasing bubbles out of the system. Gravity is your friend because liquid is heavier than gas, so bubbles always tend to rise. AVID's bleed procedure allows the isolation of the caliper so it can be bled completely before moving on to the rest of the system. Then by pushing fluid from the caliper up to the lever, you remove any air in the hydraulic line. From there, it's just a matter of purging those bubbles out of the reservoir. That said, it's important to make sure that the bike is situated in the stand so that the caliper is always lower than the lever during bleeding. One last thing before we get going. Remove the wheel from the bike so that you can access the pads easily. Pull the pads out either by hand or with a pair of small pliers. Using an 8 or 10 millimeter box wrench, spread the pistons fully apart. Be careful not to damage the pistons. Then reinstall the pads and the wheel, or you can install the pads and the AVID Juicy Pad spreader clip. This step ensures that you don't inadvertently overfill the system during bleeding. This is especially important if the pads are worn. Once we finish the bleed, I'll show you how to reset the pads for optimal performance. Fill one syringe half full with AVID high performance dot fluid and close the hose clamp. Then pull a couple of milliliters of fluid into the other syringe, just enough to lubricate the plunger seal. Degas the fluid in the half full syringe. Getting all of the air out of the fluid now gives you the ultimate brake bleed. To do this, leave the hose clamp closed and pull down on the plunger. You will see bubbles appear from nowhere in the fluid, which is air suspended in the fluid. Pull on the plunger a few times. You should see bubbles start to form in the fluid each time you pull on the plunger. Be careful not to pull too hard or you will pull air past the seal of the syringe. Also, it helps if you lightly tap the syringe to get any bubbles that do form to rise to the top of the fluid. After you've done this a few times, open the clamp and carefully push the excess air out. Then reclamp the hose so that air can't get back into the syringe. You can't eliminate all of the bubbles in the fluid, but after you've pulled a few times and the number of bubbles decreases, you're ready to move on to step 2. Use the T10 Torx wrench to remove the caliper bleed port screw from the center of the banjo bolt. The code caliper features 2 bleed screws on either side of the banjo fitting. We recommend that you use the bleed port on the outboard side of the banjo fitting during normal bleeding. Now screw the half-full syringe into the caliper bleed port. At this point, it's important to make sure the reach adjuster is not so far out that the lever blade is bottomed out on the lever body. This can make bleeding the brake impossible. For models with pad contact point adjustment, turn it all the way to the out position. This does not apply to the Juicy 3 or 5 as they do not have this feature. Now, check the angle of the lever on the handlebar. You can either position it straight up and down, or at a slight angle like it would usually be set for most riders. Just make sure it isn't too horizontal, otherwise you may not be able to bleed all of the air out of the lever. Remove the lever bleed port screw and install the couple milliliter syringe, leaving the clamp on the syringe open. Now unclamp the caliper syringe, then squeeze the lever closed against the bar and fasten it with a rubber band or tow strap. This closes off the master cylinder and isolates the caliper, allowing the removal of any air from the caliper only before moving on to the rest of the system. Gently push the caliper syringe plunger in with your thumb, then pull it slightly back out. If there is air in the caliper, this draws it back into the syringe. Be careful not to pull the plunger out too hard or you will suck air past the seals. Release the plunger to replace the bubbles you just removed from the fluid. Tapping on the caliper with a non-marring instrument helps bubbles to move out into the syringe. Repeat the process until no more bubbles are drawn from the caliper. Once this is accomplished, close the caliper syringe clamp. Remove the rubber band or toe strap to release the lever blade. While holding the caliper syringe up to prevent bubbles from floating back into the system, open the caliper syringe clamp and push on the plunger to force fluid from the caliper syringe up to the lever syringe. Do this until the caliper syringe is nearly empty. Make sure you don't push any air into the caliper. Close the lever syringe clamp, then the caliper syringe clamp. At this point, you are done at the caliper end. Remove the caliper syringe and reinstall the bleed port screw. Have a paper towel ready to catch any fluid that may come out of the port when removing the syringe and reinstalling the screw. Once the screw is installed, wash the caliper with water to neutralize the dot fluid. Open the lever syringe clamp. Draw a gentle vacuum on the lever syringe by pulling on the syringe plunger. This pulls air bubbles out of the reservoir. Release the plunger to replace the bubbles you just removed from the fluid. Tapping on the lever with a non-marring instrument helps bubbles move out into the syringe. You should also squeeze the lever like you are braking a few times while bleeding. Repeat the process until no more bubbles are drawn from the lever. Once the lever is bubble-free, give the syringe plunger one last gentle push, then release and close the syringe clamp. Now unscrew the syringe from the bleed port. Place a couple of drops of dot fluid on the top of the open port and replace the bleed port screw. Have a paper towel ready to wick up any fluid that may well up in the port. Once the screw is installed, wash the lever with water to neutralize any excess dot fluid. If you've changed the lever position, rotate the lever back to its original position and retorque as follows. Juicy 5, 7, Carbon, Ultimate, and Code torque to 25 to 30 inch-pounds. Juicy 3 torque to 30 to 40 inch-pounds. Rotate the shifters back to their original positions if necessary and retorque to the manufacturer's specifications. Finally, I mentioned at the beginning that I'd show you how to reset the pads for optimal performance. Remove the wheel again or the pad spreader clip. Look at the pads and gently squeeze the brake lever until you start to see the pads advance towards one another. When they're about 1 to 2 millimeters apart, firmly push the pad spreader clip into the gap between the pads. This will set the pads so that they are an ideal distance from the rotor once you reinstall the wheel. Okay, now just reinstall the wheel and you're ready to roll. Well done. One last helpful tip regarding storage of your tools. First, keep the brake fluid container capped whenever you're not using it to avoid contaminating the fluid. Then, store your syringes with the hose clamps open. Otherwise, the clamps can deform the hoses, making them difficult to use again.